I want to begin with autism as a disability. There are many people who see disability as a shame, and they will say, I don't see myself as disabled, or as I don't see you as disabled. We need to understand this term disability to understand why it benefits us and why it's important to emphasize autism as a disability. I'm working with the approach taken by the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. Broadly speaking, a disability is when somebody is different in some way, or impaired, or perceived as impaired. Impairments would mean like if your body is damaged in some way, if your brain is damaged in some way. Those could be examples of impairments. And perceived impairments is when somebody is different, but other people see them as damaged. So there are differences. But disability is when those impairments in interaction with societal attitudes place those people at a disadvantage. That happens to autistic people. Autistic people are placed at a disadvantage. The world is not designed to help us to fit in very well. And because of that interaction between our differences, whether you regard them as errors or whether you regard them as mere differences, it makes no difference. We still experience this discrimination largely. And that's what disability is. So are you being discriminated against because of your differences, because of differences in your body, your mind, and how you think? Then you have been disabled by society, and you have rights accruing to you as a result of this United Nations Convention. So that's on.
Autistic persons are particularly exposed to professional approaches and medical practices which are unacceptable from a human rights point of view. Such practices, justified many times as treatment or protection measures, violate their basic rights, undermine their dignity, and go against scientific evidence. Autistic children and adults face the proliferation of medicalized approaches, relying on the overprescription of psychotropic medication. This may be particularly harmful and lead to the deterioration of their condition. All too often, such practices amount to ill treatment or torture. The autism spectrum should be understood from a broader perspective, including in research. We call for caution about enthusiastic attempts to find the causes of autism and ways to cure autism through sophisticated but not necessarily ethical research. It should be recognized that autism is not a disorder or disease to be prevented or cured, but a lifelong neurological variation that is both genetic and highly hereditary. Autism is just as valid as any other neurotype. Autistic self-advocates have been striving to popularize the concept of neurodiversity to counter the ongoing pathologization of autism and its framing as a global epidemic and huge financial burden by the WHO and many of its member states, including Switzerland. Only autism acceptance will guarantee our inclusion and allow us to participate and lead without fear of repercussions. Autistic persons' right to participate in public affairs guaranteed by the CRPD, and the fight against stigma and abuse must begin with our involvement in any and all public policy decisions with regard to autism. Trauma, stigma, and autism. Stigma is a form of trauma. It targets people on the basis of beliefs about them that have nothing to do with who they are. It undermines a person's humanity and our shadows the fullness of their identity by placing assumptions about negatively perceived qualities over openness to their actual personhood. Although trauma is often framed in terms of a terrorizing event, it is the perceived physical and/or psychological threat to our personhood and residual self-protection that underlies much of the suffering involved. Having our humanity threatened, undermined, and devalued is fundamentally traumatic. It can shift us into a hyper-aroused state of defensive safety-seeking or guarded withdrawal and self-isolation. This kind of trauma is experienced as shame. Theologian, philosopher, and counselor John Bradshaw explored shame thoroughly. He distinguished innate shame related to healthy humility and toxic shame acquired through experiences of abandonment, rejection, blame, and abuse that oppress us into believing our fundamental humanity or true self is defective and flawed. This core of invalidation often stays with a person right into adulthood and creates internalized shame-related problems. Autistic individuals often experience the chronic assault of invalidation trauma in the form of stigma, as do many others who don't fit dominant expectations of what people are supposed to be like. Autism, otherness, and invisibility. It is our behavior, communication, and quality of presence that brings the most poignant stigma. We are judged, dismissed, marginalized, rejected, and stereotyped because our actions do not conform to conventional standards, and our social value is diminished accordingly. If the stigma cannot be explained by differences in appearance, orientation, or other identifiable factors, people will start blaming themselves. These are the ones most desperate to find out why they experience stigma, and who seek most diligently to better understand what makes them different. It has only been relatively recently that the role of trauma has been explored as a factor in mental health. Trauma can make the challenges of neurodivergence. Sorry, I cannot pronounce other word. Total tongue breaker. Anyway, so the challenges of neurodivergence worse and cause great emotional suffering, yet it may be the most neglected variable of all. This became trauma in the fiber of his being. It manifested itself in the form of dissociation, an inability to be present in the moment when stigma became activated, hypervigilance to rejection, and high levels of physiological arousal triggered by perceived deficits of acceptance. It was feelings of isolation and abandonment during his long recovery. The quality of an individual's life can be significantly impacted by accumulated feelings of perceived exclusion, abandonment, and disrespect. When we experience repeated stigma, judgment, rejection, and/or prejudice because of qualities inherent to our personhood, qualities we may not be able to change or may not have chosen. We may end up experiencing identity fatigue, a form of complex trauma involving chronic assaults on the fullness of our humanity. Chronic invalidation builds up traces of shame, ready to activate when oversensitive safety scanning puts us on physiological high alert to threats that may not logically seem to justify our response. We may be on the lookout for potential sources of further invalidation and defensively protect ourselves with outbursts that make it difficult to function. We may experience sadness and unworthiness that lead to isolating protective measures. Judith Herman discussed the state of chronic humiliation, of feeling unaccepted, how shame can be a physiologically stressful experience, and the role of shame in the development of traumatic disorders. Repeated experiences of stigma related to various forms of invalidation can become emotionally damaging events and a source of distressing complex trauma. Stigma is not just an unpleasant social problem, but a source of personal suffering with life-altering consequences. Awareness of this aspect of stigma should be considered part of the growing sensibility in our culture about the impact of trauma in society. A better understanding of stigma and autism not only provides a unique perspective on the widespread problem of invalidated humanity, but also gives us helpful traction to work with the poignant difficulty. Loosening the grip of shame is possible one step at a time by managing the defensive reactions associated with invalidation trauma. Finding ways to counter everyday stigmatizing processes and reimagine stigmatizing beliefs and assumptions helps create an environment of validating acceptance that nourishes shame resilience. Stigma can be based on visibly apparent things, such as skin color, gender, and overt behaviors. It can also come from concealable things, like certain forms of physical and mental health, diagnostic labels, sexual preference, socioeconomic status, and religion. Sometimes the most challenging forms of invalidation come from intangible things that are hard to pinpoint, but can still be used to determine a person is not one of us. The stigma of autism comes from all three sources and often involves oppressive coercion to conform, as one autistic woman puts it, as if I am only worthy if I behave in a certain way that neurotypicals find acceptable. Certain core challenges we all experience can lead to stigma when our difficulties stand out more than normal. The history of autism is so intertwined with this complex form of oppression. Chronic invalidation can lead to an oversensitive danger alarm in the body-mind, waiting to be activated by the smallest trigger. We have much to learn from autism in this regard, because the humanely erosive process of chronic invalidation is constantly at work through stigma and stigmatizing micro-events that can make us feel like crawling under a rock, or even aliens on this planet. Whenever conventional beliefs are challenged, there is resistance from society, especially by authoritative experts whose opinions are based on established convention. Feeling judged and dismissed amplifies existing emotional regulation issues, providing a model that illustrates the cycle. Accumulated experiences of invalidation related to abuse, neglect, and stigma, as well as other violating assaults on our personhood, can cause trauma to build up in our body. This leads to heightened safety distress or defensive psychological escalation triggered by the organism's need for safety, which may or may not be conscious. When overactivated, such safety distress can trigger a cascade of difficulties, including emotional escalation and flustering that worsens whatever challenges of neurodivergence may already be present. Trauma is not always so extreme and is not necessarily related to single catastrophic events. It can also be associated with poverty, harassment, bullying, loss, and chronic invalidation. Trauma can be perpetuated by self-beratement and complicated when it involves repeated exposure over time, such as ongoing abuse, disregard, neglect, and being forced or choosing to endure a toxic or oppressive environment. Such trauma is often referred to as complex trauma. Judith Herman is often credited with first articulating this in her seminal book Trauma and Recovery. She specifically mentions prolonged terrors such as captivity, child abuse, and spousal abuse as sources of this kind of trauma, and talks about a new diagnosis called complex PTSD. This formulation has not been officially adopted in the DSM-5. Trauma, Stigma and Autism, Developing Resilience and Loosening the Grip of Shame by Gordon Gates.
That thing, that takes away the panic and anxiety so that you can start making these decisions. It gives you motivation to be better. It helps you start to own your power and your sense of worth so that you can start saying, not that, but that. But it's not going to make those choices for you. It puts you in a place where you can, when you're not living in a constant state of shutdown. It gives you the motivation to want to do better and be better.
It gave me this sense of like, I can be independent. I can find my own self out there, and I don't need anybody else. I've got everything we need is out there. And, but then also like within us too. So yeah, it was very empowering and very exciting to kind of just have this major shift in my life and change my perspective.
I got called a bitch. I got called ruthless. I got called intolerant because I started cutting people out and saying, nope, no more. You're just not allowed back in because of the way they made me feel. And I don't mean people that I felt intimidated by. You know what I mean. People that triggered, people that are frightening and unnerving, chaotic, and attacking, blaming, sketchy. You know that energy. Those are hard decisions to make, and you'll get called names when you do shadow work, because the masses don't want to feel intimidated. Most people that are not doing this work don't want to be reflected back to that they're not doing it. So be prepared to get called names and to get kicked by the people you're leaving to move into new spaces. And then when you get lucky enough to find somebody that is living in a life that you're working toward to allow you to circulate in their world, then show up and take that and bring it from your future and anchor it in your now, and anchor that and seed it and give it energy and life and let it blossom and grow. And in that place where I'm not worthy and shame and imposter syndrome, that shadow shit trying to come back in place of it, when you put equality, worthy, valuable, have knowledge, assets, and gifts to give, if you anchor that, eventually you'll embody it, and then you'll just feel like you belong there. That's how we build our reality and continue to grow where we're going.
The sense of agency is not straightforward. A mechanism which allows one to attribute one's own actions to oneself. The sense of agency depends on the sensory feedback resulting from the action. In other words, it depends upon a bodily experience. Damasio, 1999. Thus, perceptual information specifies egocentric self-location and spatial embodiment, and this, along with proprioceptive awareness, gives one a sense of oneself as an experiencing organism and a sense of one's current capabilities. What we need is more agency, the ability to cut through all of what pulls at us, find emotional and physical balance, think more clearly, and advocate for ourselves, so we can take a course of action that makes sense. With agency, we can feel more in command of our lives. Surround yourself with friends, family, and communities who encourage you to reach your full potential, nurture your talents, affirm your values. Having more agency means taking responsibility for your life. The next time you sense something happening around you or within you that doesn't feel quite right, don't ignore it and reflexively press on. Exercise the discipline to stop, pay attention, and work on finding a better path for yourself. By practicing more agency, you'll have more influence over your life and greater impact on the lives of others.